Okay, so over the course of our semester, I've talked about a number of traits which are multifactorial. Heart disease, asthma. They're multifactorial because there are a variety of genes which are involved. So you could have inherited at conception a form of this one gene or another gene which increases your risk. But then things like diet, exposure to air pollution, inflammation, a whole host of other things are environmental factors which can increase your risk. And the same is true of weight gain. So what I would like to do is just quickly give an overview of weight gain and type 1 diabetes, just to show that they are also then multifactorial and how complex they are, because the incidence of each is rising in our population, and they're of grave concern. And so if we're going to understand these serious threats to health, obviously we have to, understand them in their complexities. So first off, it was once thought that fat cells were rather simple things, essentially just lumps of triglyceride. But it turns out there's an awful lot of biology that fat cells are involved in. So first off, these fat cells individually, and then the tissue of adipose tissue, which could include some white blood cells as well. These cells make hormones, a bunch of them, all right? And so therefore, this is not just a lump of triglyceride. This is a signaling cell in the body, and thus this is important. One of the major hormones made by fat cells is one called leptin that was discovered not all that long ago. I remember when it was discovered. It's a major hormone. So for example, it is required for normal reproduction. When the human body is trying to time when puberty should begin, this is tied to adipose, especially in women, so that there is an adequate number of calories stored in the body already prior to the onset of reproductive a competency, given that pregnancy and lactation takes so many calories, it wouldn't be advantageous for a woman's body to be capable of reproduction if adequate energy reserves had not begun further. All right. So once again, you'd like to consider adipose as just being, an energy store. But leptin and other signals, which I'll get to, are pro-inflammatory. They're affecting the way that immune cells develop. They're affecting bone. They're affecting the stress response. Now, that's not perhaps their major job. The major job of leptin is to be, quote, a lipostat, just in the same way that your house has a thermostat, which helps you regulate the temperature. You want to regulate how much fat is in your body. The brain is doing some of this. So obviously, here's the question: how does the brain know how much fat is stored under your skin, for example, or in your abdominopelvic cavity, if we're referring to visceral fat? And the answer is that fat cells make this hormone that talk to the brain. All right. And so therefore, the hypothalamus receives this leptin hormone and is thus then getting a measure at how much adipose there is in the body. And thus it can then respond by affecting levels of hormones that it is making. Now, at conception, we receive genes for making leptin. We receive genes for making leptin receptors, all right? And so obviously our cells can make this hormone and can make receptors for this hormone because we have genes for it. And like any gene of the human body, these can vary, or even we could have mutations in which these genes don't function as well as they should. And this could lead to overeating and obesity. And so when we talk about weight gain, there is a genetic component. There are genes which can be inherited at conception, which would then affect our ability to gain weight. But then there is more, because this leptin, it turns out this hormone has so many effects throughout the body. And as we gain weight, this now means that there are more adipose cells making more leptin. This then increases our risk of cardiovascular disease. So as your leptin levels goes up, so too does your susceptibility to heart disease. Our risk of cancers, including breast cancer, goes up as levels of leptin go up. And this affects many other aspects of physiology as well. And so this is now one of the reasons then to be concerned with weight gain, because obviously I'm recording this in the year of coronavirus, and so that's obviously a major effect on mortality. But prior to this, the longevity expected for people was actually going down after decades and decades of just a steady increase. And one of the reasons for that is we as a society, and not just in the United States, but in most countries throughout the world, certainly developed ones, the average weight of individuals is increasing. We have more and more adipose, and that's in part because food is easier to get, calorie-rich food is easier to get, and so thus so too are these other ailments. So as weight increases, so too does heart disease. Does blood pressure. While asthma, for example, can affect anybody, those who are hospitalized for asthma are most likely to be overweight. And so these adipose cells and some of the hormones that they're making, like leptin, they're having profound effects throughout the body. So immune cells are in adipose tissue. And when adipose make signals, then this influences these immune cells. So for example, I have a video. This is just going to be a quick overview. Eosinophils are a type of immune cell, and fat cells are talking to them and having an effect on them. Eosinophils, for example, have a major role in asthma development. Basophils are pro-inflammatory, and inflammation can then increase one's likelihood of heart disease, of asthma, and other disorders. And so leptin coming from fat cells is promoting the degranulation of these basophils, promoting inflammation and allergy. So, as our weight increases, our tendency to develop allergies might as well. And so as we look at NK cells, which are immune cells, if we look at dendritic cells, which are cells which present to T cells as we're looking for lymphocytes. These hormones have an effect, including the balance of Th1 versus Th2. So are you more likely to develop immune cells which are going to promote asthma, allergy, autoimmune diseases, etc.? Well, the balance between these types of lymphocytes, the Th1, Th2, that helps to determine this. But the hormones coming from fat affect this. And so weight gain is having profound effects throughout the body because of the multiple effects of leptin. And it turns out leptin is just one hormone coming from adipose. There are others. So for example, there's this one hormone, adiponectin, which actually has opposite effects. It's anti-inflammatory, reducing the risk of heart disease. All right, and so this can be affected. Obviously we have genes for adiponectin and its receptor, but gender has a role in how much adiponectin we make, as does overall body weight, etc. And so there are other hormones as well. One is called resistin. And one of the reasons this hormone is called resistin is It's affecting what's called insulin resistance. The precursor to diabetes, at least type 2 diabetes, is insulin resistance, where you need more and more insulin to have the same effects. And so here is a hormone which fat cells are producing, increasing the risk of type 2 diabetes. Plus, whether it be the fat cells or the white blood cells, which are in fat tissue, can make a whole host of inflammatory signals. And once again, the higher your rate of inflammation, the greater your risk of heart disease, the greater your risk of asthma, etc. And so this is not just a hunk of triglyceride sitting, in a tissue. It's talking to the rest of the body, and thus, as we gain weight, that's more signals. Now, in weight gain, one very often, what we could do when studying disease is study what normally happens and then look at then what is altered in pathophysiology. And one of the amazing things is just how many signals are involved in weight gain and metabolism. So, for example, the brain needs to know whether it should be hungry or not. So the hypothalamus, and then to a lesser extent, the pituitary gland, they're getting signals. So leptin is coming from fat, but ghrelin is coming from the GI tract. So the GI tract talks to the brain. Peptide YY from the large intestine is talking to the brain. Insulin from the pancreas is released after a meal, talking to the brain. Estrogen, which both men and women make, affects metabolism and is talking to the brain. Glucocorticoids released from the adrenal glands during stress, components of meals. So the brain gets all kind of signals coming in, which will, help it determine what the metabolic rate should be. And then the hypothalamus, and to a lesser extent, the pituitary gland, make all sorts of hormones which then affect some aspect of metabolism, hunger, predisposition to weight gain, etc. So look at all of these different signals. So weight gain is complicated. So these are all genes. All right, they have receptors. These are signals with receptors. And so as you go from one individual to another, there are variations. Your likelihood of gaining weight is different from that of the person next to you, because you might be making more of these or a slightly different version of these. So there's a whole lot of biological signaling going along with weight gain. The pituitary makes a fascinating protein called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. And this is interesting because while it's one protein, it ends up getting cut up into a lot of little pieces. Each of these pieces then becomes a separate signal. Each of these signals affects some aspect of weight gain or metabolism or hunger or et cetera, maybe through stress or maybe through other aspects. And so there are so many signals then. And so biologically, our predisposition to gain weight varies. So for example, MSH is involved in a signaling which affects some aspect of metabolism. And a lot of people have a variation on the MSH receptor. And if it's not working well, then that is a genetic cause of weight gain and obesity. And so once again, there's just all of these various components. One other thing is we have these are those melanocortin receptors. I just mentioned the receptors where they can cause obesity if mutated. The brain is involved. One of the things that the brain is involved in is reward pathways. So when you eat food, all right, that sends a signal of pleasure, and there's reward in the brain. But we can vary in this. We can vary to the degree to which we are rewarded for eating food. And this then can affect weight gain. It has long been known that smoking marijuana can affect hunger. But for a long time, no one knew why. And then it was discovered that the element of the effective element in marijuana, THC, is very similar to a signal made in the brain called an endocannabinoid, which is involved in feeding circuits. And so here's another biological key here. And there are so many others. All right, so here's just one that seems random, but there is a primary psyllium on most cells of the human body. So while a few cell types have lots of psyllium, most cells have at least one, and it's what's called the primary psyllium. And genes whose mutations affect this primary psyllium very often cause obesity. So a number of these diseases known as ciliopathies can then affect weight gain. So once again, there are just all of these diverse genetic causes of weight gain. And then once weight is gained, then there's all of these other biological aspects. So here's an extremely overweight cat. And I want to point out that there's different areas of adipose. Adipose is developing under the skin here. All right, so this is subcutaneous adipose. And then there's what's called visceral fat, all right, which is developing in the visceral cavity. So you'll see this in a second. Inside the pelvic body cavity, there's going to be adipose in the mesentery around the small intestines or around the kidneys, etc. Well, it turns out there are different types of fat. Visceral fat, for example, can release the hormone visfatin, which has an effect on weight gain and diabetes risk that other adipose might not. So you can see all of that adipose in visceral fat. So when we talk about gaining weight or gaining adipose, another question is, where is this adipose being gained? Because if it's being gained in the abdominal pelvic body cavity, that is worse than if it is gained subcutaneously. If it's gained subcutaneously, gaining weight in the abdominal area, which is where men tend to gain weight, has worse effects than gaining weight elsewhere in the body. So depositing adipose, say, on the thighs or on the upper arms, etc. So the point here is that if you wanted to understand weight gain, as we should, because it is such an impact on other disease states like heart disease, like asthma. The more higher weight you have, the higher your blood pressure, the greater risk of coronavirus, et cetera. We need to understand it. And it turns out that there's a whole host of genes, a whole host of hormones, in addition to all of the dietary aspects of, the number of calories, et cetera. One could even make, the statement that there are, then societal aspects as well. So for example, when our commercials for food on a television program that you might be watching. So if it's 11 o'clock at night, you're getting ready for bed. If you're seeing commercials for food, you might now get hungry and eat more. Or if you look at the layout of your town, if your town has prioritized keeping people fit, then there might be jogging trails and places where fresh produce are sold, etc. If not, there may not be safe places to exercise, and there might be a great abundance of food which is less nutritious and higher in calories. And so just living in one town might encourage you losing weight, and living in another town might encourage you gaining weight. So I just wanted to point out that, weight gain for a lot of people is very simple. If you eat more calories than you burn, you're going to gain weight. If you lose more calories than you eat, you're going to lose weight. But there's actually a lot of biology involved. And then when we consider parts of your diet, societal aspects, et cetera, there's a lot of interaction between genes and environment. I also have a playlist on type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease. Now, I just want to quickly go through this with the idea, like, it does get a little complicated. I just wanted to point out it's there, especially if someone might be, interested in this. But I just want to hit some highlights here. So Diabetes is obviously affecting, our insulin production, which comes from the pancreas. It's affecting sugar in our bloodstream. But if we were to talk about it, we would be talking to a great extent about the immune cells. Because one of the things immune cells have to do is to distinguish between self and non-self. This involves proteins called MHC proteins, the major histocompatibility complex. The genes for these are called HLA genes, the human-like leukocyte antigen. These are on chromosome 6, and they complex with another microglobulin protein on chromosome 15. And so we make these genes, but it turns out that there's lots of different forms of them, lots of different alleles. So all of us have HLA-A genes, but which form we have varies, all right? So there's thousands of different alleles. All right, and it turns out, as we'll see, that some of these alleles are going to affect diabetes risk. And so we have these cell ID badges, which will then, these MHC proteins, then take a little piece of developing protein, and this video goes into how that is done, and wears it. So if you make a protein inside the cell, but then you attach a little piece, all right, so here's a little piece of a protein from inside the cell, but we're going to attach it to this cell ID badge, which is going to go on the cell surface, all right? And so as a result, on the outside of the cell, a white blood cell will be able to say, aha, here's a cell ID badge with a little piece of what's going on inside. It turns out that which alleles we receive then can have an impact on our diabetes risk. And so if we look at alleles, and because there are so many of them, they have a complex numbering system. There are some which protect us from diabetes, and there are some which promote diabetes. So some of us at conception were more likely to develop diabetes than others because of the proteins which are presenting to white blood cells. Now, in type 1 diabetes, your white blood cells decide that the cells which make insulin in your pancreas are foreign and they need to be destroyed. Now, that shouldn't happen, all right? We should tolerate self, all right? So here, I have some videos where I go through what should happen, all right? We should happen that your immune cells learn, hey, insulin is okay. That belongs to the body. These other, things, they're okay. And if there are any white blood cells which are tempted to destroy an insulin-making cell, that we inhibit those. So let's say here's a cell that says insulin, bad, I want to kill you. Well, as we develop, we should have other white blood cells which say, ooh, you shouldn't do this because this is self. This belongs in the body, and therefore we allow this. However, there's what should happen, and then there's what might happen instead. So as we learn to tolerate self, all right, there are a number of gene mutations in different genes, which would make us less likely to tolerate self and more likely to recognize, say, insulin or other aspects of self as foreign. Once again, it's a little in the details, so I just want to point out, that I go through this in greater detail if you're interested. But once again, here are genes involved in the immune function, which are determining, do we accept, say, the cells of the pancreas which are making insulin, or do we not? Okay, and so this is a little complex, and it not only applies to diabetes, but also to other autoimmune diseases. All right, we shouldn't attack our own bodies. We should distinguish between foreign and self. So we don't want, these cytotoxic T lymphocytes to touch a body cell and say, "Hey, I'm going to destroy, this cell in the pancreas, which is making insulin." And so there's all of these cells which should, be working to prevent this, but things go. Go wrong. What could go wrong? Well, there are gene mutations. So there are gene mutations which could cause the dysregulation of the system so that we are not doing so we are not distinguishing between self and foreign as we should. But in addition to genes, there's also the environment. So, here's a weird example. If you've got two identical twins, all right, so for a lot of cases, then you'd expect them to have the same genetic trait. All right, but it turns out that with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, that's not necessarily the case. There is a 50% discordance rate. So if this twin has diabetes, what are the odds that this twin will not? Well, it turns out that works out half the time. Why? Well, because there are so many environmental things which will play a role. It's not just genes, it's viruses, especially the enteroviruses in the digestive tract, changes to the microbiome, as I'll say, vitamin D deficiency, the things in our diet. And so this is truly multifactorial. There are genes and the environment. Now, a lot of this, it's easy to study in experimental animals like mice, but nevertheless, evidence suggests that this is true in humans as well. That the bacteria which we have living in our guts will either protect us from diabetes or dispose us or predispose us to it. So all of us have lots of bacteria in our large intestine, for example, but which bacteria they are can vary. All right, so you might have different populations than I. So the most common microbes in your large intestine might be different from mine, and we can see both in animal studies and in human studies when we look at infants, etc., that you can associate diabetes with certain bacteria more so than others. And so in children who are developing diabetes, very often a change in the bacteria precedes their developing diabetes. And there are a couple of things which occur at the same time. As we go from children to adults in early childhood, the gut microbiome transitions. All right, so you go from the infant diet to an adult diet, so there's changes in your gut microbes. The immune system is maturing, and if you're going to be diabetic, this is also when antibodies against beta cells typically first arise. All right, so the bacteria you have in your large intestine, that plays a factor. Viruses play a factor. So there's a lot of evidence that viruses can promote type 1 diabetes. The amount of interferon, which is an antiviral protein, can then predispose us to diabetes. And so one of the fascinating things here is, one, how much biology you can learn, whether it be weight gain or diabetes. It's not this simple on-off switch. You end up talking about all of these complexities of, the immune system or the hormones of adipose, et cetera. So for example, why might you attack yourself? All right. Well, one weird one, that most people I don't think would appreciate is once we make a protein, we process it. All right. So in the endoplasmic reticulum of our cells, we process proteins. We fold it the right way, and then sometimes we change some of the amino acids. All right. So we could, for example, change the amino acid arginine. All right, which is a normal amino acid. We could change it a little bit and make it into another slightly different one called citrulline. All right, so see, arginine and citrulline are a little different from each other. Well, it turns out if you're doing that in your pancreas and you change some of the amino acids just by tweaking them, now white blood cells might, instead of recognizing this as self, which they have learned to tolerate, identify this as foreign, which they then attack. So it's now become what's called an autoantigen. It's one of your own proteins, which is being treated like an antigen. It's something foreign. Okay, so just in conclusion, there are certain, disorders which are relatively simple. What causes malaria? Oh, we know what causes malaria. It's this one microbe called Plasmodium. Problem solved. But when we look at so many of the disorders which affect us most and affect mortality, and also those which are increasing, the way that weight gain and type 1 diabetes are increasing in our population, it turns out they're really complicated. There are a lot of genes involved. There are a lot of environmental factors involved. And so as a result, your likelihood of developing diabetes or your likelihood of gaining weight is now determined by this complex interaction of which genes I have and which environmental factors I have. And so, I have some playlists with some videos which just hopefully introduce you to these points. Let me just